Hello, my name is Andrew Root, and I'm coming to you from the Twin Cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. And it's a pleasure to be with you. More specifically, I'm actually coming to you from my basement, and it has been over 3 months since I've gotten a haircut. So you're just going to have to deal with that. But what I'd like to contribute for this TheoCon is a paper, a presentation called "Time, Famine, Resource Obsession, and the Good Life in a Pandemic." So in the middle of February, my 12-year-old daughter threw herself on the floor right before she was supposed to be out for the bus and cried, saying, I wish it was just a weekend all the time. Fast forward a month later, and in the middle of March, she threw herself on the same spot of the floor and blubberingly cried, all I want to do is go back to school. So like many middle-class families, we had big plans, or at least busy plans, for 2020. Instead, we've watched all of those plans just dissolve or disappear or be deleted into the ether dust of a Google Calendar deletes. So while COVID-19 has taken many things, maybe its most direct thing it's taken from families and young people has been the loss of their plans. And so it's been painful to watch those graduation tests and sports tournaments be canceled, and then or if not completely canceled, have a kind of weak online imitation of themselves. So at one level, this canceling of things and the shutting down of families racing in busy schedules is a good thing. It's not all bad. It's actually been nice to have a reprieve from some of the speed. One of the things that we have to recognize is that this racing and this speeding up and going fast to try to be part of all of these activities and have these full schedules, it wasn't just benign, or it wasn't for anything. So to take on the good of it being nice to slow down, we also have to wrestle with the fact that there are reasons that we're implicitly and at times explicitly connected to our sense of the good life for these really busy schedules. So COVID-19 can be a reprieve from the exhausting pace, but for this reprieve to actually be beneficial, we have to face the question of actually what makes life good in the first place. Now, for me, practical theology at its really disciplinary core has something to do with action. And I want to follow and have been following the philosophical school that revolves around Charles Taylor that makes the argument that human action really can't be understood outside of understanding its connection to embodied imaginations of what's good and what makes life worth living. So I want to lean into that. But I want to lean into that with this presentation, not really by drawing much from Taylor, but actually moving beyond Taylor to discuss one of his best collaborators, most interesting kind of next generation of thinkers drawing from his work, the German social theorist Hartmann Rosa. And I want to relate Rosa's work and its sense of being connected to the good life to the crisis of our pandemic here. Now, I'm very aware, particularly sitting in this spot, just 3 miles, 4 miles away from the epicenter of the protests here in Minneapolis, that there are other crises that could be discussed and could be wrestled with. But I'm going to wrestle particularly with COVID-19 and how it relates to our kind of sense of the good life. And hopefully that gives us some preliminary kind of discussions and conversations about what this means for practical theology. Now, truth be told, a lot of these ideas I have been already working on in a forthcoming book that will come out in 2021 called The Congregation in a Secular Age. But I'm taking the occasion of this conference to kind of turn those specifically and look at how they relate to our pandemic. So let's jump into this and move to the first section of this paper, of this presentation, which we'll call Welcome to the Time Famine. So Hartmann Rosa makes this odd assertion that feels really true to me. He says that it's really odd that in late modernity, the more technological innovations that are birthed, and particularly the more identity innovations that are birthed. So in other words, the more technology we have, as well as the more freedom it feels like to seek our most authentic, unique identities and selves, what that delivers for us is not more time, but actually less time. That we don't feel a surplus of time, but actually a deficiency of time. And in some senses, you work the other way. I mean, if you can just be whoever you uniquely are, you don't have to correlate to some kind of external moral codes. And if you have technologies that can connect you with the world through video chat like we're using right now, then in a certain sense, shouldn't we have more time? This should free up more time. But as Rosa says, it never really works this way. Rather, our technology and our free options for identity doesn't lead to more time, but lead to what Rosa calls a time famine. So here's a quote from Rosa. He says, in modernity, people increasingly feel that they are running out of time, that they are short on time. Rosa believes no one actually can escape this deprivation, this loss of time, this sense of feeling like you're in a time famine. Though he is really clear that people in different class levels and people in different cultural locations have a different sense of how time works. So he actually says that there's 3 different layers to this sense of a time famine, which I think is very interesting for us to kind of lean into. He says at the top layer of this time famine are those who we might call the elites, or even kind of middle class folks. Maybe my family and my daughter rest in this kind of situation. But these are people who feel this time famine, this loss of time, this need to accelerate time, that this feeling comes in an internal way, that we feel a deep desire, especially as it relates to the good life, to not waste our time. And that impetus to not waste time is embedded within ourselves. We even think of our own lives historically, and we think, what if I hadn't wasted those few years studying this thing and should have been studying that? So there's this sense of the time famine being an internal thing, that you are worried that you might waste time, or there's this sense that time is sacred, so you better not waste it. So in our contemporary moment, particularly in the US, such people at this layer of the time famine ironically don't feel much of a rush to get back to work. They control their own time, even if they're quite anxious about it, which I think they are. They nevertheless control it, and they can make a moral choice to stay home and wonder why others aren't doing that. But then that leads us to the second layer of the time famine. And the second layer, Rosa says, are people who don't necessarily feel this internally, but they're people that feel the pressure of time and the need to accelerate time, and therefore feel in a time crunch or a time famine. But that pressure or that imposed famine comes from outside of them. So it tends to come from people, or these tend to be people who are living paycheck to paycheck, people who are working in the service industry or other blue-collar jobs. So Rosa says it like this. He says people working these kinds of jobs are always short on time, but usually it is someone else, the boss or the clock, who creates the pressure. And it's not so much coming from within. So in our pandemic, some of these people don't even have a choice to stay home, even if they wanted to. There are certain levels of these people who are essential workers, that they need to be at grocery stores stocking shelves. And the rest of those who maybe aren't quote unquote essential workers, they nevertheless feel pressure, but that pressure maybe isn't even from a boss now, as their jobs have been laid off, but they feel the pressure of the coming rent, that they need to pay rent. And this has become a big debate in the States about how much unemployment benefits should last. Should it be renewed and last longer? Or does that discourage these people? Does that take away the external drive to get back to work and to speed up their lives? So these tend to be the people who lose their jobs and just lose so much in neoliberal economies. But then Rosa, he doesn't say as much about this, but he says there's another layer, a final layer as well. And these are people he calls forcefully excluded or forcefully decelerated. And what he means by these kind of people are, these are folks who are chronically unemployed, maybe on disability, and some of them, of course, are homeless. And Rosa explains, here's a quote from him. He says, forced or enforced deceleration is a kind of devaluation of the time that you have. So there isn't actually necessarily pressure here. I mean, there's maybe some deeper injustice. There is deeper injustice that plays here. But what happens in this third layer is that your time itself becomes devalued. And people even resent you because you seem to have so much time and not be using this time. So you lose this kind of sense of time. Now, for Rosa, what these 3 layers mean is that this time famine affects everyone, is that there's no way to avoid this, that all of us who live in modern Western societies feel this kind of sense of being in a famine. of a time famine. But he says what you do in the midst of this scarcity, and one of the ways you cope with the scarcity, is to become very concerned with resources. That resources become a way of dealing with this time famine, which of course makes all sorts of sense, that in any kind of sense of scarcity, resources are what you think will help you. So you try to harvest resources. Now, what we could define a resource as is we could define a resource as a source or supply which a benefit is produced that has some utility. So resources are can broadly be classified upon their availability. So there's benefit and availability, and that's what makes a resource really valuable. So Rosa wants to point out that resources are always about time, and we hold on to them vigorously or fight for them because we think that they'll help us. So we are always in the midst of feeling kind of this crunch. We're always trying to harvest resources as a way of dealing with the contingencies of the future. So like in a global pandemic, it's kind of no wonder that all the toilet paper disappears, because it becomes a very concrete resource that people hoard to make them feel secure in a deep sense of kind of the whole shifts in time being reworked. So we're led to believe that the only way to actually survive this time famine is to win resources, and I think that becomes a quite significant thing. And we'll see how this is related to the good life, and we'll do so by turning to our next section, and it will point us and get us closer to talking about how this affects congregations as well. So this leads to a section we'll call resource obsession in the good life. So Rosa wants to argue that the time famine has two major elements to it that impose themselves on us. And one of these elements is that there's an overall acceleration of the modern project, that things just keep speeding up, that modernity is always the process of acceleration, of things just going faster. And he wants to say one of the effects of this, what happens in the midst of this, is that we end up having our experience of the present feels to be shorter and shorter, that the present itself gets compressed, that inside of this kind of time famine, that we feel like the present becomes ever shorter. And Rosa, in his book, Acceleration and Alienation, or it could be the other way around, Alienation and Acceleration, really gives us a kind of genealogical phenomenology of how our experience of the present, say from medieval Christendom, has become quite a bit shorter, that the new becomes really significant. And in consumer societies and in neoliberal societies, the new becomes quite important, and it kind of sucks us out of the present always to be projecting into the future. So this becomes one of the epidemics of being a late modern person, is that our body is rarely where our mind is, or our mind is rarely where our bodies are, that we're in the present as embodied creatures in the present, but we're always kind of projecting ourselves into the future, always planning for what's next, always looking at how we're going to deal with what's coming next week or next year or at retirement, say. So the present itself becomes too short. And one of the things that Rosa wants to point to as he relates this to Taylor's sense of the good life is that the present becomes so short that it no longer is able to inhabit the good life, that the good life can no longer be planted and grow in the present itself, but that the good life, the present is so short that it becomes void of the good life, that the good life actually becomes projected only into the future. So the present becomes too short, decaying too rapidly to allow us to hold to any imagined or even material constitutions of the good life. So things are just moving too quickly that we always have to be kind of looking for the future. So the good life doesn't, what the ramifications of this are that are, I think, very important for us, is that the good life then has no content. That if the good life is embedded in the present, it has all sorts of content, and it can even be passed on with a distinct kind of form of content. This is what the good life looks like. But when the good life is a projection into the future because the present is so short, then for the most part, and this links up with what Taylor's talking about, the age of authenticity, and particularly the ethic of authenticity, is that we feel it impossible to and it inappropriate to share the contents of the good life, that every individual has a right to define their own sense in the present of the good life, or to be aimed towards some future good life. That in many ways the present becomes so short that it can't bear the good life itself. So this becomes a major ramification of this for Rosa, that in the midst of the time famine and the resource obsession, which we'll circle back into here in a second, the present becomes so short that it can't embody the good life itself. And what the good life is all projected into the kind of future. It's the future that bears the good life, which then it kind of starts to help us understand why particularly those at the top layer of the time famine might start to feel quite a bit of crisis during this pandemic, because all these activities have ended. All the activities that were used to project into the future to harvest resource for some future good life, and the good life having some sense of being out in the future. And what makes you feel like your life is good now is that you're trying to get to the good life in the future. All those are over. And we don't know when we can speed our lives up again to have those, that we're just drawn into the present, in some ways captured in the present. And this becomes difficult, I think, for late modern people, especially as late modern people have little sense of what the good life is in the present. In the now, we're in some ways stuck in the now, or it's starting to loosen up. But for sure, for those 3 months, it was a kind of existential crisis of what it meant to be and be bound just in the now. In the future was so cut off that it was hard for people to even plan it, for people to even know. And I think that has deep ramifications on them. So let's push this a little further by going into a section we could call dreaming of the future. So when the present becomes so short that the good life can't even be bound in the present, but has to be projected into the future, that the future always bears the good life. What that means is that the good life becomes intertwined with this sense of the dream, or what I would call it becomes bound in the dream state. So the future is always bound in some kind of dream. So the good life is really about helping young people or yourself find their way into living their dream, living whatever dream that they really want. So the good life becomes marked by this dream. There's no content for the good life in the future. There's no practices or traditions or communities necessarily in the present that deliver the content of the good life. But the good life then does become about projecting into the future, working your way by harvesting resources to be able to have whatever dream you would have, that you would desire in the future, which would be the substantive arrival towards the good life itself. So the dream state becomes really significant. Rosa says it like this. This is a quote from him. He says, "Modern societies may not have an answer to what the good life is or what it consists in the present," he means. But it has a very clear answer to what the preconditions of living a future good life are and what to do to meet them. They are: secure the resources you might need for living your dream, whatever that might be, has become the overruling rational imperative of modernity. So it becomes about living this dream. So we start to understand why resource obsession becomes so important, because resource obsession, having resources in the present, becomes a way of working your way and setting yourself up to get your dream. And the good life is embedded in having that dream. So when the good life is for the future, then the present is for harvesting as many resources as you can so you can live whatever dream you want in the future. So we can now start to see why, again, canceled sports seasons and test prep and so much more can be an existential crisis for parents as much as young people. So young people can feel it, but parents can really feel this burden that their job to be a good parent was to help their kid have the resources and be moving towards the resources so that they could have their dream and live the good life. Again, they're not focused on the contents of the good life in the present, but the good life in the future. Let me give us another, maybe more concrete example that could help. If we think of back in March 2019, the FBI uncovered that there was a massive college admissions scam in the U.S. And what it was, which gave it a ton of media interest, was elite parents, even a few celebrity parents, who had bribed and lied and cheated to get their kids into elite universities, particularly the University of Southern California and Yale. Now, most of us who watch this story wonder why. Like, why do this? These were some filthy rich people. Why did they feel the need to cheat and lie to get their kids into these schools. I mean, clearly they didn't need a university degree to have financial opportunity in the future. I mean, their future was bright. So why do you need to go to USC at all? Why need to go to university at all? But this misses actually how the good life is completely a projection into the future. It makes resources really important because the point of the university degree was to give their kids another important connection, a status resource that they could use to live whatever dream they wanted in the future. So the point was to help them have this resource, to live whatever dream that they wanted. So as good late modern parents, their goal was to give their children the resources they would need to live whatever life they wanted as they projected themselves into the future. So again, I'm just trying to help you see that the future becomes the place where the good life is actually lodged. So Rosa adds, and here's another quote from him: no matter what your future might bring, it will help if you have money, rights, friends, health, and knowledge. Again, these resources to get to that. And of course, we could add to Rosa's list with our story if you had a degree from elite university. So what these parents in the college admission scam did is they weren't really concerned about the financial issues. They had a ton of money, but what they did feel, I mean, they didn't feel like they had a financial crunch on them, but they did feel an absolute crunch of the time famine. They just felt like they simply didn't have enough time to get their kids' SAT scores up, even if that was possible, nor did they have enough time to have their kid actually be on a crew team. So without the time, the most efficient way to help their kids have the resource to live whatever dream they wanted in the future was to actually game the system. So in the end, getting into Yale wasn't about the money at all. It was about the resources, and the resources were a way to get into the good life, which again is projected into the future. So hopefully not overdoing this, but another quote from Rosa, which I think is quite powerful. He says, the ethical imperative that guides modern subjects is not a particular or a substantive definition of the good life, but the aspiration to accrue the resources necessary to help for leading one. In a way, we moderns represent a painter who a painter who is forever concerned about improving his materials, the colors and brush, the air condition, the lighting, the canvas and the easel, but never really starts painting. So you can see, I think, in a very colorful way, Rosa talks about how us modern people are always working at rearranging our resources for some future action, for some future living inside the good life than for it right now. So this leads us to a section of thinking about when the dream becomes a nightmare. So this becomes this future orientation becomes a way of trying to live the good life, but there's of course an inherent problem with it. The inherent problem with it is that it doesn't give us much content to live the good life in the present and doesn't order our present very well. But it also has this sense of always being projected into the future, is that in some ways you can never arrive at it. And if you do arrive at it, you start to realize that it doesn't fulfill in many ways, that you just have to keep going for it. So this all means that the resources you have are often never enough, that you just need to keep having resources because your dream is always out before you. So you just need to continue to anticipate and try to get these. And so you can see as a parent, as the problem with the good life always being in the future is that you try to give enough resources and then give some more resources and then give some more resources so that eventually that you can help protect your child from all contingencies, from all problems. We could use a little bit more, so just in case this happens. But of course, one of the real, I think, existential crises of the pandemic is that you can never accrue enough resources to protect your kid or protect your own sense of the future dream from when a pandemic comes. I mean, there's a certain sense that you could accrue so many resources and have so many resources that you could protect yourself from all future contingencies. But of course, what the pandemic reveals is that there's some things that you can't even do that for, that your future isn't just dependent upon you being able to get all of these resources, which I think pushes a lot of parents and maybe young people themselves into a certain crisis at this time, as they realize that there are things beyond their control and that they played the game just the way they were supposed to play the game, and nevertheless the future resources that they had garnered for themselves may not deliver the good life they wanted. But there's something exhausting about this, even more so, is that enough is never enough, because the good can only be satisfied out beyond you in some unattainable future. So there becomes a vicious cycle. There's this never-ending projection into the future to secure your dream, which induces you further into a time famine. So the time famine causes us to look for the good life in the future, to compress the present, look for it there. But that only speeds up our life more, to make the present feel shorter, to make us have to go faster to get more resources. So we become like farmers who have kind of over harvested the land. And instead of just resting in the present and having some content in some form of what it would mean to live the good life in the present, we just keep on trying to harvest more to get more, again, until a pandemic comes and you're forced to slow down. So this is kind of the vicious trick of late modernity, is that it invites us to compress the present, and then always be racing for the free dream that we want to possess. But can we ever really possess it? And this is something actually that the novelist David Foster Wallace saw in the 1990s. He saw it really starkly, and I think it makes reading his novels really interesting. But Wallace had this sense that you can never really arrive at your dream, and even if you did actually arrive at your dream, you quickly discover that your dream doesn't really satisfy, that the good life that's in the future, it never really produces the beauty of the good life itself. So Wallace becomes an interesting tale, because even if you can get to this future dream, for instance, having all the resources you would need to have that dream, like a bestseller, like awards, prestige, fame, you start to discover that the dream is empty, that the dream can't actually deliver, that the dream only has its potency and significance in always being out before you. So once you actually harvest it, once you actually attain it, it loses its significance. And so the only way to mitigate against this is to never actually reach your dream, to never actually get there. Just keep moving the goalposts further and further. And that is a legitimate way to cope with this reality, until it becomes that you're so exhausted, always chasing a good life that's always in the future, that it wears you out. Now, of course, the tragic story of Wallace is that he feels this so acutely that he ends his life, and that becomes very hard for late modern people to look at his story too long. It's kind of like staring at the sun; it will burn your retinas, because it is a prophetic articulation of kind of the hollowness of losing any kind of sense of the good life in the present itself. And Wallace's story shows us that even if you can get to your good life, if you accrue your dream, if you have your dream, that the dream often can become hollow. So you're better off never even making it to your dream. Just keep pushing it or keep adding to it. But that leads to a deep kind of sense of dissatisfaction, that you never can really arrive at the good life. Now, this has something to do, and I think plays really particularly importantly to the way we think about our congregations. So the sense of time famine and the good life, as always projected in the future, has its way of imposing itself even on our congregational life. So it's often taken in by pastors and denominational officials, and they start to believe that to be a good congregation in many ways is to have the good life be projected into the future as well. So the congregation that seeks resources and provides resources is the congregation that does well. So a congregation needs to really focus on attaining and accruing more resources so that it can have its own dream of even surviving. So more members, more programs, more relevance becomes these kind of resources that supposedly will give the church more time to survive. So this becomes taken deeply in, I think, to the consciousness and the imagination, probably a better way of saying it, in the imagination of congregational life. And so in this sense, where people even go to congregations looking for help in dealing with their time famine, that they're looking for advice, they're looking for assets for their kids, they're looking just for strategies to cope with their own time famine, so that they're looking for ways even to get to their dream. A little congregation has very little value, because a little congregation can't be a resource for busy people chasing their goal. So in our history, of course, in the history of Protestantism across the West, the history of the church more broadly across the West, is that when the present encompasses the good life, a little church can have value. It can help people and give people practices, rhetorical forms, traditions, community, of course, that can give them the very content and shape of the good life. But when the good life becomes shifted into the future, then what does a little congregation do? What's the point of a little congregation? And it becomes completely eclipsed inside a time famine by other churches. And so you get the arrival of big mega churches and giga churches like Rick Warren's Saddleback or Joel Osteen's Lakewood, and are the thousands of less famous examples. And these churches become the kind of congregation because they become about helping people have the resources. They themselves have the resources to live whatever dream they want in the future. The little church with doesn't have much. It loses its potency. While it would have potency if the good life was embedded in the present, it loses that potency. And now it just becomes racing to try to accrue resources, hoping it can win the lotto and be one of the very few, one of the millions or thousands of little churches that actually grows into a big church that can harvest resources. This becomes quite problematic. And so, and what becomes even more problematic is those people who lead those mid-sized or small churches, this kind of imagination, even their default view of what makes a church good or how a congregation lives in the good life, follows this late modern trap, and it gets embedded in their imagination of their own practical ecclesiology and even their own view of their own vocation. So how does a little church survive then? Well, the little church survives by entering into a process of innovation. And so innovation becomes a way of capturing more resources for the congregation to survive and not perish. Hence is the reason, if you come to the U.S., and maybe this is true other places as well, but one of the most common words you'll hear, bishops, other denominational officials, seminary presidents, and church consultants, the word that they'll always use is innovation, believing that innovation will save dying churches. What's often not recognized is how such a logic rests on a problematic sense of the good life and a concession to this late modern sense of being projected into the future. Now, let me give just a little bit more content on what this means, this kind of resource obsession of projection into the future. And Rosa does a nice job of articulating this. So, of course, most of us don't take the kind of tragic step that David Foster Wallace did. And one of the reasons we don't is because there is a pretty significant structure here of how we go about accruing these resources to get to our future. It rarely, if ever, actually provides what it says it will, but there's a certain way to think about this. And the way we can think about this chasing of our dream and what gets us to our dream, almost the very things we use, the trampolines that move us to our dream, is what Rosa calls the AAA. So to quote him again, he says, "The modern way of acting and being in the world is geared toward making more and more of its qualities and its quantities available, accessible, and attainable." So availability, accessibility, and attainability become what he calls the AAA. So the person or institution who's able to thrive in this kind of short present while being free to chase a dream seeks availability, accessibility, and attainability. So in other words, we could say that the best congregations are those with the most availability, accessibility, and attainability, hence those big mega and giga churches. So even to make this even a little bit more concrete, maybe we need to return to our college admission scam. So again, why break the law? I mean, we've looked at how this becomes a resource. That's a reason to break the law. But why do it? I mean, why do these elite families risk this? Like we said, they don't need the money. Their children's earning potential is set. As a matter of fact, it could hurt their earning potential. Like say one of these elite kids sits through a philosophy class that they have to take at Yale or USC and reads Wittgenstein in their first year philosophy class and then decides to be a philosophy major. Or worse, decides to do a PhD and become an academic. Well, then your financial impact is quite a negative one. But of course, most parents are willing to risk this and send their kids to school, even with the potential problem of becoming a philosophy major, because they're not sending them again for earning potential, but they need to go to elite schools. And this matters to parents that they go to these elite schools, willing to cheat to get into elite school, not because it's the degree that matters. They don't need to go to an elite school for the degree. What they need to go to the elite school for is the availability, accessibility, and attainability that an elite school offers. So getting into your top school, like Yale, gives you availability to important people, accessibility to exclusive institutional status, and an overall attainability of whatever dream you wish. So these elite parents lie and cheat to get their kids to AAA. In universities, I mean, they can charge, well, in the States, these elite universities can charge $50,000 a year because they know, even though that's an extraordinary amount of money to pay, that we'll pay it. But we don't pay it because we actually think that Yale, say, or Harvard or Princeton is 3 times, 4 times better in teaching and learning. They are better in teaching and learning, but are they really that much better in the sense of how much the ticket price, the sticker price is? Are they really that much? Well, the truth of the matter is that we're not paying for teaching and learning. I mean, which is a deep shame and a problem. But we're not paying for teaching and learning. What we're paying for is availability, accessibility, and attainability. We're even willing to go in debt, spending all sorts of our resources, our money, so we can exchange that for other resources of availability and accessibility and attainability. What we pay for is that. So you can think like a humble little school like Minnesota State. When it comes to teaching and learning, maybe Yale is better, but is it that much better? No. But what it's far better at, Yale is giving young people availability, accessibility, and attainability. And that's what you're paying for. So these elite parents, or for those of us at the top layer of the time famine, it's just really not an option for our kids not to go to college or university. We don't even care that their major prepares them for some job. That's not why you go to college, to actually learn the skills you'll need to work whatever job that you'll work. You can learn those the first year you're on the job, but you need the university degree to have the availability, accessibility, and attainability. So we're not concerned. I mean, we don't have an existential crisis if our kids don't go to college or go to university because we think, oh, they'll never read Plato or Dickens or study biology or understand economics. That's not the existential crisis. The existential crisis is that we're worried that they'll have a deficit of availability, accessibility, and attainability. And without availability, accessibility, and attainability, they won't have the resources to live whatever dream they want in the future. And without being able to live their dream, they'll never have any access to the good life, and therefore they'll die very unhappy. So we ask our children, and we ourselves just rush and have these full schedules, trying to accrue these resources, trying to connect our kids through the things that they're involved in to availability, accessibility, and attainability. That becomes the real driving force here. And it is interesting, I mean, a little sidebar, but it is really interesting how getting into your dream school, your dream university, is a kind of perfect late modern dream, which is why you see it in movies, or you see so many young people really enamored with it, because it's the perfect late modern dream, because it's one of the few late modern realities where it's accomplished. You actually can accomplish it in the present. You get in. You get the letter, you get the email, maybe it's now, that says you've been admitted. So you've gotten into your dream school, or you've attained your dream. But even once you attain that dream, it's never really about the present, because it catapults you into the future. It tells you that you are now the kind of person with this kind of availability, this kind of accessibility, and this kind of attainability. And a degree, really, those AAA from that university will give you a chance to live whatever future you want. So it's the perfect late modern dream, because though it can be substantiated in the present, it's never really about the present. It's about the future. So you wonder why some particularly American young adults just get stuck in kind of university mode as they are pushed out of that mode, and they just long to kind of get back into it. So this moves us into our kind of penultimate section for my presentation, and what we could call style and scope of the AAA. So one of the ways then, if you're always projected into the future, that you're always looking for availability and accessibility so you can have the resources to attain whatever dream you want, and the present becomes so void and becomes so short, and it definitely becomes contentless. The good life becomes contentless. There are no agreed upon, at least, traditions, rhetorical forms, communities, practices that embed that. But nevertheless, there becomes a way to inhabit the present that makes it livable. And you have to be a very honest person like David Foster Wallace to kind of bear the existential crisis of the good life not having any location, even when you harvest your dream. And one of the ways you do this, and one of the reasons, and one of the things that this movement into the future always kind of rests on us, is that we kind of seek this AAA, and we hope what this AAA will produce is scope. And scope becomes a way of inhabiting the present that always is directed towards the future. So this kind of sense of someone who has scope is a way of showing that you have accrued these availability, accessibility, and attainability, so that you can have your future. So these rich kids in the college admissions scam need to go to Yale and USC, again, not so that they can learn and be intellectually formed, but so they can have a style of scope. So scope means you could go to a dinner party and have someone whisper, "Hey, look, there's Madeline. She's so interesting. She started her own charity after going to Mozambique, and then in ninth grade, she actually started a nail polish business. She's a great entrepreneur. And you should see her Instagram account. It has 300,000 followers. And she went to Yale." That's scope. To give you another example kind of scope and how this works, and how it works as its projection to the good life into the future, think about the characters in Wes Anderson films, particularly think about the children in Rushmore or the Royal Tenenbaums. What's interesting about those characters is that they have a humorous amount of scope, that their parents have seen it as important to give their kids the style necessary for living the good life. But of course, in Anderson films, what happens with these kids that have been molded for scope and have such a bright future, writing novels at 9 years old, and being painters, and all things like that, that they end up getting stuck. And so having nothing else than scope, they're actually tortured by the present, and it becomes at least humorous in these Anderson films. So Anderson characters, or the made-up woman we had in the example above, their sense of the good is completely a projection into the future, but like a character in one of Anderson's movies, they relate to the world in the present through scope. And scope, to make this all circular, reveals that one of these characters is the kind of talented person who can relate to the world in such a way that he or she can innovate, maximize, and accrue resources. So your future scope shows that your future is bright, that your dreams will come true. Of course, this never happens in Anderson films, which is what makes them funny. But this person may not have their dream now. The person with scope may have not have a dream now, but the scope shows that women and men want to be with them, and women want to be her. And so it's as good as a down payment. So this leads us to our final section to talk about misguided scope. Now, scope, of course, it isn't all bad, and it reveals a certain way of relating to the world. And so there's something that's fundamental about us that really desires scope, that wants scope. But in late modernity, inside of time famine, we can only imagine the good kind of out in the future. What can happen with scope is scope can become all there is, that there becomes very little substance within that. And living just in this way without a good life in the future, the world itself in some ways doesn't speak to us. It doesn't feel living because it's always projected in the future, which I think makes it harder for people in our congregations to have a sense of a living God. So our desire for scope shows that there is something in us that longs for something more, for something transcendent, for something to meet us even in our present, and speak of the good. Yet what Rosa contends is that unfortunately we allow scope to be flattened to style, which is kind of how I described it through Anderson's characters above. And as style, scope has no referent beyond itself. So scope becomes self-referential. And Anderson's characters show they kind of spin deeper and deeper into self-actualizing projects, which reduce the actor and take the actor deeper into the kind of aridness of the present. So Rosa says it this way, which I think is a good quote here. He says, "Alas, instead of arriving at scope, we end up turning the business of increasing our scope and our horizon of available, attainable, and accessible, and the collection of resources into an end in itself, into an endless cycle with which permanently erodes its own basis and thus leads nowhere, which is the great danger, is that then we say that scope becomes important, but scope actually has no sense of anything substantive of the good life in the present. So this takes us in conclusion kind of back to our crisis. So COVID, I think, produces many burdens and many crises. But one of the big ones is that it embeds us in the present. And for people these last 3 months, they've had to make sense of their present, and the present without being able to mitigate its aridness and potentially its lack of a substantive relation to the good life by planning for the future. I mean, we don't even know if we can go on vacation this summer. I mean, it becomes hard to plan. And most people have created their own sense of the good by, again, trying to speed up to get those resources, to get your dream in the future. But now what COVID does is it locks us in the present, at least for a while. It has locked us into the present. So people are forced to be in the present with little sense of when they can get back to procuring the resources needed for their dream and for a sense of the good life. So this opens up all sorts of questions about ministry and theology in this moment. Most particularly, it asks, how can we find ways to reflect more directly with people on what a good life is, and particularly what a good life is in a vision of a God who has been crucified and resurrected. And it asks what practices are needed and what shape of congregational life is necessary to help people live in the present and seek for a God in the heaviness of the now. So I think maybe what would be worth discussing as we think about this in relation to practical theology is just how much this form of action becomes a way that's projected into the future and keeps us from deeper theological imaginations for how God meets us in the present, and the way that time functions within this. So this epidemic, this pandemic, in many ways becomes a crisis of action. In a crisis of action for the good life. It reveals maybe that our forms of the good life had been completely idolatrous and had been so projected into the future that they were hollow in their own right. But now people have to bear this hollowness, and maybe this becomes a place to have a deeper theological conversation. But it does also point us to, very importantly, I think, that we have to have visions for what a congregation is and how a congregation functions, as well as what the church is even more broadly, that escapes some of these cul-de-sacs and dead ends of this view of the good life, always as a projection into the future, always as a dream state, always embedded or correlated with resources, always needing to be about availability, accessibility, and attainability. I think there's been a hidden kind of draw or a hidden current that's said the only churches that will survive are those that can accrue more and more and give to their people, therefore, more and more availability, accessibility, and attainability. To what? To whatever dream they want to live, to being an asset for whatever dream they want to live. And I think we have to rethink that in a deep way. It leads us to rethink, what is the good life? What does it mean to think about innovation? And what does it mean to be church at all?